The scorching summer of 1876 brought more than just heat to Idaho City. Idaho, it brought a silence that would change Bethany Lawson's life forever. The 22-year-old daughter of the local apothecary woke one morning after weeks of raging fever to discover the world had gone completely silent, her hearing stolen by the illness that had nearly claimed her life. Miles Landon watched from the doorway of his modest blacksmith shop as Dr. Wallace emerged from the Lawson residence, shaking his head solemnly. The news spread quickly through Idaho City. The apothecary's daughter had survived the fever but would never hear again. Miles had known Bethany since they were children, though they'd rarely exchanged more than pleasantries when she came to deliver her father's remedies to injured ranch hands. Now, as he observed Mr. Lawson guiding his daughter through town for the first time since her illness, Miles noted how differently she moved, cautious, eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, startling at movements she couldn't anticipate. "Poor thing," Mrs. Peterson muttered beside him. "Such a tragedy. She'll never marry now." Miles frowned at the woman's callousness but kept his thoughts to himself. He'd always admired Bethany's quiet determination, the gentle way she tended to everyone who entered her father's shop. The loss of her hearing didn't change who she was. That evening, as Miles closed his shop for the day, he found himself walking toward the small library at the edge of town. Mrs. Bailey, the librarian, looked up in surprise when he entered. "Mr. Landon, don't believe I've seen you in here since you were in school." Miles removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Madam, I was wondering if you might have any books about talking without speaking." Mrs. Bailey's eyebrows rose. "You mean sign language for the deaf?" "Yes, madam, that's it exactly." Her expression softened with understanding. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the Lawson girl, would it?" Miles felt heat rise to his face. "I just thought someone ought to try." Mrs. Bailey nodded, disappearing between the shelves. She returned moments later with a thin, worn volume. "This came in last year from back east. It's not much, but it has some basic hand signs and finger spelling." Miles took the book gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Bailey." "You're a good man, Miles Landon," she said softly. "That girl's going to need friends now more than ever." For weeks, Miles studied the book by lamplight after long days at the smithy. His hands, calloused from years of metalwork, felt clumsy attempting the delicate gestures illustrated on the pages. He practiced until his wrists ached, memorizing the hand alphabet first, then simple phrases. Meanwhile, Bethany struggled to adjust to her silent world. Her father had been patient, writing messages on a small slate they kept handy, but communication was tedious and limited. Customers at the apothecary shop often grew frustrated trying to make themselves understood, sometimes leaving without making their purchases. Bethany spent most days in the back room, mixing remedies and avoiding the pitying looks from townspeople. One autumn afternoon, when the aspen leaves had turned golden, Miles gathered his courage and entered the apothecary. Mr. Lawson greeted him warmly. "Afternoon, Miles. Need something for those burns. Working the forge in this heat must be brutal." "No, sir," Miles replied, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Miss Lawson." Mr. Lawson's expression wavered between surprise and curiosity. "Bethany? Well, she's in the back, but—" He hesitated. "You know about her condition?" "Yes, I do, sir. That's why I'm here." Curious, Mr. Lawson led Miles to the back room where Bethany sat grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up when she sensed their presence, her blue eyes widening slightly at the sight of Miles. Her father wrote something on the slate, and she nodded, setting aside her work and wiping her hands on her apron. Miles removed his hat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his work clothes, soot still clinging to his forearms. Bethany watched him expectantly, and for a moment his mind went blank. All those weeks of practice, and now he couldn't remember a single sign. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hands and slowly, carefully formed the letters, Hello. Bethany's lips parted in surprise, her gaze fixed on his hands. Miles continued spelling out, Mynameismiles. Tears welled in Bethany's eyes. She looked to her father, who appeared equally astonished, then back to Miles. Her hands trembled as she carefully mimicked his movements, spelling back, Hello. It was rudimentary and painfully slow, but in that moment, Miles felt as though he'd given Bethany something precious, a bridge across the silence that had isolated her. The smile that illuminated her face confirmed it. "Where did you learn that?" Mr. Lawson asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Bailey had a book," Miles explained, never taking his eyes off Bethany. "I've been studying it for a while now. I'm not very good yet, but I thought—" He hesitated. "I thought Miss Lawson might like to have someone to practice with." Mr. Lawson cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. "I think that would be just fine, Miles. Just fine indeed." Over the following weeks, Miles visited the apothecary whenever he could spare the time. Their conversations were basic at first, simple greetings, yes and no questions, the names of objects around the shop. Bethany proved a quick study, often mastering signs faster than Miles could teach them. She began keeping a journal of new words and phrases, sometimes creating her own signs when the book provided none. By the first snowfall, they had established a routine. Miles would close his shop early 3 days a week and walk to the apothecary. Mr. Lawson, seeing the positive change in his daughter, welcomed these visits and often left them alone to practice. Sometimes they would sit by the window, watching the townspeople pass by, and Miles would spell out stories about the customers who visited his smithy. What began as lessons in sign language gradually evolved into something deeper. Miles found himself sharing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, his hands forming words his voice might have stumbled over. Bethany, in turn, revealed the frustrations and fears she'd kept hidden since losing her hearing, her terror during thunderstorms she could no longer hear approaching, her sadness at not being able to listen to the church choir at Christmas, her worry that she would forever be a burden to her father. One evening in late January, as Miles prepared to leave after their lesson, Bethany touched his arm to stop him. Her fingers were gentle against his sleeve, but the contact sent warmth coursing through him. She took the slate from the counter and wrote carefully, "Why are you doing this?" Miles stared at the question, unsure how to answer. He could have said it was Christian charity or neighborly kindness, but neither felt true enough. Instead, he took the chalk and wrote, "Because you deserve to be heard." Bethany studied his words, then erased them with her thumb. She wrote, "Even before I lost my hearing, no one ever really listened to me the way you do now." Miles felt something shift between them in that moment, a recognition of something neither had put into words. Before he could respond, Mr. Lawson returned from his deliveries, and the moment passed. But as Miles walked home through the snow that night, he realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with Bethany Lawson. Spring came early to Idaho City that year. The snow melted rapidly, turning the streets to mud and causing the creek to swell dangerously. Miles was repairing a broken wagon wheel when Sheriff Thompson rushed into his shop. "Need your help, Landon," he said breathlessly. "Creek's flooding the east side of town. Lawson's place is taking on water." Miles dropped his tools immediately, grabbing his coat as he followed the sheriff outside. Several men were already heading toward the apothecary with sandbags and shovels. When they arrived, water was already seeping under the door of the shop. Mr. Lawson was frantically moving crates of medicines to higher shelves. "Where's Bethany?" Miles asked, his heart racing when he didn't see her. "Upstairs, packing some things," Mr. Lawson replied. "We might need to evacuate if the water keeps rising." Miles nodded, helping to stack sandbags against the door. The work was back-breaking, and the water continued to rise despite their efforts. After an hour, Sheriff Thompson ordered everyone to move to higher ground. "Grab what you can carry," he instructed. "We're setting up at the church." Mr. Lawson looked devastated as he surveyed his shop. "My medicines. Everything we have. We'll come back for it when the water recedes," Miles promised. "Right now, we need to get you and Bethany to safety." They hurried upstairs to find Bethany had already packed 2 small bags. When she saw Miles, relief flooded her face. He quickly signed that they needed to leave, explaining about the rising water. She nodded, but then signed back urgently, pointing to her father's medical journal's irreplaceable records of remedies and treatments compiled over decades. Miles understood immediately. "Mr. Lawson, where are your journals kept?" "The cabinet in the back room," he answered. "But it's too late, the water's probably reached them already." Before anyone could stop him, Miles was heading back downstairs. The water had indeed risen, now ankle-deep in the main shop. He waded to the back room, finding the cabinet partially submerged. Working quickly, he pulled out stacks of leather-bound journals, tucking them inside his coat to keep them dry. By the time he made it back upstairs, water was nearly at knee level. "We have to go now," he insisted, handing the journals to Mr. Lawson. They made their way outside where the street had become a shallow river. Miles lifted Bethany into his arms despite her protests, carrying her through the rushing water while her father followed with their belongings. The journey to the church on higher ground was treacherous, but they arrived safely, joining dozens of other displaced townspeople. The church was crowded and chaotic, families claiming space on pews and along walls. Miles found a quiet corner for the Lawsons, helping them set up a makeshift bed with blankets provided by the Ladies' Aid Society. Bethany seemed overwhelmed, her eyes darting anxiously around the unfamiliar setting filled with people she couldn't hear. Sensing her distress, Miles knelt before her, gently taking her hands to focus her attention. He signed slowly. "You are safe. I am here. Your father is here." She nodded, squeezing his hands gratefully. They remained that way for a moment, until Miles realized several people were watching them curiously. Such intimate contact between an unmarried man and woman would normally be considered scandalous, but no one seemed inclined to comment. Perhaps they recognized the necessity of touch in their unique form of communication. For 3 days, the floodwaters held Idaho City hostage. Miles divided his time between helping with rescue efforts and checking on the Lawsons. Each evening, he would return to the church exhausted and mud-covered, but he always made time to sit with Bethany, signing the day's news and sometimes just providing silent company when words seemed inadequate. On the 4th day, the water finally began to recede. As residents cautiously returned to assess the damage to their homes and businesses, Miles accompanied the Lawsons back to the apothecary. The sight was disheartening: shelves toppled, glass bottles shattered, and a thick layer of mud covering everything. Bethany's shoulders slumped as she surveyed what remained of her father's livelihood. "It will take months to rebuild," Mr. Lawson murmured, his voice hollow. Miles placed a hand on his shoulder. "You won't do it alone," he promised. Then, turning to Bethany, he signed, "We will help. The whole town will help." True to his word, Miles organized a recovery effort for the apothecary. Farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area, many of whom had benefited from Mr. Lawson's remedies over the years, came to assist with cleaning and repairs. The Ladies' Aid Society held a benefit supper to raise funds for new medicines and equipment. Even children pitched in, carefully washing mud from salvageable bottles and jars. Throughout it all, Bethany worked tirelessly, her determination inspiring everyone around her. She developed an efficient system of hand signals to direct the volunteers, and many began picking up basic signs just to communicate with her. Miles watched with pride as she refused to let her disability hinder her participation in the restoration effort. One evening, after most volunteers had gone home, Miles found Bethany alone in the newly cleaned back room, carefully arranging dried herbs on freshly installed shelves. He tapped gently on the doorframe to get her attention. "Everything looks good," he signed when she turned. "Your father will be pleased." Bethany smiled, setting aside her work to sign back. "We could not have done this without you." Miles shook his head modestly. "Everyone helped." "Not everyone learned my language," she responded, her hands moving with increased fluency. Over the past months, they had both become more proficient, their conversations flowing more naturally. "I wanted to understand you," he admitted. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "I still want to understand you, everything about you." Bethany's eyes widened slightly, her cheeks flushing. She hesitated, then signed. "Why?" Miles stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "Because I care for you, Bethany, more than as a friend." The confession hung between them, weightier than any words he had ever spoken aloud. Bethany stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. For a terrible moment, Miles feared he had misinterpreted everything between them. Then, slowly, she raised her hands and signed. "I care for you too." Relief and joy flooded through him. Acting on instinct, Miles reached for her hands, gently entwining his fingers with hers. The gesture was both an interruption of their conversation and the beginning of a different kind of communication, one that required no words or signs at all. They might have remained that way indefinitely, had Mr. Lawson not returned from his errand to the general store. Miles quickly stepped back, releasing Bethany's hands as her father entered the room. If Mr. Lawson noticed anything unusual, he made no comment, simply thanking Miles for his continued help. "Actually, sir," Miles said, his voice steadier than he expected, "I was hoping I might speak with you privately sometime soon." Mr. Lawson glanced between Miles and his daughter, a knowing look crossing his face. "I'll be home tomorrow evening," he replied. "Perhaps you could join us for supper." Miles nodded gratefully. "I'd be honored, sir." The following evening, after a meal that Bethany had prepared with obvious care, Miles found himself alone with Mr. Lawson in the small sitting room above the shop. He twisted his hat nervously in his hands, struggling to find the right words. "Mr. Lawson, I've come to greatly admire your daughter," he began. "Her strength, her kindness, her determination. She's the finest woman I've ever known. Even with her condition," Mr. Lawson asked carefully. "Her deafness doesn't diminish who she is," Miles said firmly. "If anything, it's shown me her true character. I've never met anyone braver." Mr. Lawson studied him thoughtfully. "And what exactly are your intentions toward my daughter, Miles?" "I'd like your permission to court her properly, sir," Miles replied without hesitation. "And if she'll have me, to marry her someday." Mr. Lawson was silent for a long moment. "You're a good man, Miles. I've always thought so, but I need to know, are you certain about this?" "Caring for someone with Bethany's needs won't always be easy." "With all due respect, sir, I don't see it as caring for her needs," Miles countered. "I see it as building a life with her challenges and all, the way any married couple would face life together." A smile slowly spread across Mr. Lawson's face. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing, son." Miles shook his hand firmly, relief and excitement coursing through him. "Thank you, sir. I promise to do right by her." "I know you will," Mr. Lawson replied. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Now, I believe there's a young lady in the kitchen who's probably wondering what we're discussing. Perhaps you should go put her mind at ease." Miles found Bethany pretending to wash dishes, though her nervous glances toward the sitting room betrayed her curiosity. When she saw him enter, she quickly dried her hands, her expression questioning. "Your father has given me permission to court you," Miles signed, unable to keep the smile from his face. "If that's what you want to." Bethany's entire countenance transformed, joy radiating from her as she nodded emphatically. Then, surprising them both, she stepped forward and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek, her first such bold gesture. Miles felt the warmth of it spread through him like sunshine. As summer approached, Miles and Bethany's courtship became the talk of Idaho City. Some thought it peculiar a blacksmith courting a deaf girl, but most found it touchingly romantic, especially as more people witnessed their unique way of communicating. Miles had built a special display case for the apothecary counter, where he left Bethany a different wildflower each morning before opening his shop. In return, she would leave him small packages containing homemade remedies for his frequent burns and cuts. Their courtship was unlike any other in Idaho City. Unable to take Bethany to musical performances or dances, Miles instead planned outings that engaged her other senses. They took picnics along the creek, where they could feel the spray of water on their skin. He showed her how to identify different metals by their weight and texture in his workshop. On warm evenings, they sat on the hillside above town, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors so vivid no words were needed to appreciate them. Miles also continued expanding his knowledge of sign language. He wrote to schools for the deaf in the East, requesting any books or pamphlets they could spare. When a traveling photographer passed through Idaho City, Miles commissioned him to take photographs of various signs, creating a visual dictionary that he and Bethany could reference. Not everyone supported their relationship. Miles overheard whispers at the saloon, men questioning why he would saddle himself with a deaf girl when there were plenty of normal women looking for husbands. Once, when Bethany was shopping alone at the general store, Mrs. Henderson loudly remarked that it was unnatural for a deaf woman to marry and have children who might inherit her defect. Bethany didn't hear the cruel words, but she saw Mrs. Henderson's disapproving look and the pitying glances from other customers. That evening, when Miles visited, he found her unusually withdrawn. When he finally coaxed the story from her, his hands faltered mid-sign, anger burning in his chest. "Some people are ignorant," he signed after composing himself. "Their opinions don't matter." Bethany shook her head, her hands moving rapidly. "They think I would make a terrible wife, a terrible mother." Miles knelt before her chair, making sure she could see his face clearly. "You would be an extraordinary wife and mother," he signed emphatically. "Any child would be blessed to have you. And if our children were deaf, we would love them no less. We would teach them what we've learned together." The casual reference to "our children" made Bethany's eyes widen. They had not yet spoken explicitly of marriage, though both knew that was where their courtship was headed. Miles, realizing what he'd said, felt his face grow warm. "I'm getting ahead of myself," he signed apologetically. Bethany surprised him by shaking her head, a soft smile playing at her lips. She signed back, "I like thinking about our future together." The simple statement filled Miles with such happiness that he couldn't help himself. He leaned forward and kissed her, their first true kiss. It was brief and gentle, but it sealed an unspoken promise between them. As autumn approached, Miles began construction on a small house on the outskirts of town, close enough to both the smithy and the apothecary to be convenient for work, but with enough land for a garden and perhaps, someday, a place for children to play. He worked on it during every spare moment, often by lantern light late into the evening. Bethany visited the site regularly, bringing food and offering suggestions. Miles had designed the house with her in mind, a large window in every room to let in abundant light, wide doorways to improve visibility between rooms, and smooth wooden floors that would transmit vibrations she could feel. He'd even devised a special system of colored lamps that could be seen from any part of the house, allowing him to signal her from different rooms. By early October, as the aspen trees turned golden once more, the house was nearly complete. Miles had one final addition to make: a special sign carved into the doorpost, a symbol he and Bethany had created together that meant home. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, Miles led Bethany to the finished house. Her father followed a discreet distance behind, allowing them this moment together but providing the proper chaperonage expected for an unmarried couple. Bethany gasped when she saw the house, now painted a warm yellow with green trim. Flowers still bloomed in boxes beneath the windows, their late blossoms adding splashes of color. Miles watched nervously as she explored each room, running her hands over the smooth counters in the kitchen, testing the rocking chair he'd placed by the largest window, opening and closing the cleverly designed cabinets that made minimal noise. When she had seen everything, they returned to the front porch where her father waited. Bethany's eyes shimmered with tears as she turned to Miles. He took a deep breath and began to sign. "I built this house for us," his hands conveyed, "for our future. I want to fill it with love and laughter and children someday. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to grow old watching your hands tell me stories." He paused, his heart racing, then continued, "Bethany Lawson, will you marry me?" Bethany's hands flew to cover her mouth, tears spilling onto her cheeks. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she stood perfectly still. Then her hands moved in a single, emphatic sign. "Yes." The wedding took place on the first snowfall of winter, a gentle dusting that transformed Idaho City into something magical. The small church was filled to capacity, not just with family and close friends, but with nearly every resident of the town. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, though she sat in the back pew with a pinched expression. The ceremony was unlike any the town had witnessed before. Pastor Wilson had worked with Miles to learn the signs necessary to include Bethany fully in the service. When it came time for the vows, Miles and Bethany faced each other, their hands speaking promises that their hearts had long held. "I, Miles, take you, Bethany, to be my lawfully wedded wife." He both spoke and signed, his movements deliberate and clear for all to witness. "I promise to love and cherish you, to honor and respect you, to walk beside you in silence and in sound, for all the days of our life together." Bethany's hands trembled slightly as she responded, her signs graceful and sure. Pastor Wilson translated her silent vows for the congregation, his voice thick with emotion. "I, Bethany, take you, Miles, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love and cherish you, to honor and respect you, to share a language of the heart that needs no sound, for all the days of our life together." When Miles placed the ring on Bethany's finger, he added a special gesture touching his heart, then hers, a sign they had created meaning, "My heart to yours forever." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Pastor Wilson pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration afterward was jubilant. The townspeople had organized a feast in the church hall, with tables groaning under the weight of homemade dishes. Someone had hung dozens of paper lanterns from the ceiling, creating a warm, golden glow throughout the room. In the corner, a small band played for dancing, though Miles and Bethany sat out most of the lively reels. However, for the final dance, Miles led his bride to the center of the floor. He had arranged with the musicians to play a simple, rhythmic waltz with a strong bass that Bethany could feel through the floorboards. Placing her hand on his chest where she could feel the vibration of his heartbeat, he guided her slowly around the room. They moved together as if they'd been dancing all their lives, Bethany following his lead with perfect trust, her eyes never leaving his face. "I never thought I'd dance at my wedding," she signed quickly during a turn. "You're dancing in your way," Miles signed back. "Just like we do everything in our own way." As winter settled over Idaho City, the newlyweds established their routine in the little yellow house. Miles continued his blacksmith work, while Bethany divided her time between helping her father at the apothecary and making their house a home. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes signing for hours, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence in comfortable silence. Their first challenge as a married couple came unexpectedly in January, when a severe snowstorm isolated Idaho City for nearly 2 weeks. Food supplies dwindled quickly, and illness spread through the town. With the doctor snowed in at a remote ranch, Mr. Lawson became the primary medical provider, with Bethany preparing remedies around the clock. Miles helped organize the men to clear paths between vital buildings and distribute firewood to those running low. Each night, he would return home exhausted, his clothes frozen stiff, to find Bethany still awake, preparing medicines by lamplight. Despite her inability to hear the coughs and complaints of the sick, she seemed to intuitively understand what remedies were needed. One night, Miles returned to find Bethany slumped over the kitchen table, fatigue having finally overcome her. He carried her gently to bed, his heart aching at how small and vulnerable she felt in his arms. The next morning, he insisted she rest while he delivered the latest batch of medicines to her father. When he reached the apothecary, he found Mr. Lawson looking nearly as exhausted as Bethany had. "I've sent word to Boise City for more supplies," the older man told him, "but with the roads as they are, we'll manage," Miles assured him. "The town's pulling together, and Bethany's remedies are working. Sheriff Thompson's fever broke last night." Mr. Lawson nodded wearily. "She's something special, my girl, always has been." He gave Miles a knowing look. "But then, you saw that before anyone else did." When the snow finally melted enough to clear the roads, supplies arrived from neighboring settlements. The crisis had passed, but it had left its mark on Idaho City. 6 residents had died, mostly elderly or very young. But many more had survived, thanks in large part to the Lawsons' medicines and the community's cooperation. The experience had changed Bethany and Miles too, deepening their partnership and proving they could face adversity together. As spring approached, Bethany shared news that brought them both immeasurable joy. She was expecting a child in the late summer. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Bethany found it frustrating that she couldn't hear her baby's heartbeat when the doctor visited for checkups. Miles solved this problem in his typical inventive way. He crafted a modified stethoscope with a small drum at the end that vibrated visibly when the baby's heart beat. The contraption delighted both Bethany and Dr. Wallace, who asked permission to sketch the design to share with colleagues who might have deaf patients. As Bethany's due date approached, Miles expanded their home, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. He installed a special floor that would better transmit vibrations, ensuring Bethany would feel the baby's movements if it cried during the night. He also created a series of small bells attached to the baby's crib that would trigger a light in their bedroom if the infant moved excessively. The entire town seemed invested in the coming birth. Women regularly stopped by with handmade baby clothes and advice for the mother-to-be. Even Mrs. Henderson appeared one afternoon with a beautifully knitted blanket, offering a stiff apology for her previous unkindness that Bethany graciously accepted. Labor began on a sweltering August evening. Miles sent word to Mr. Lawson and the midwife, then sat beside Bethany, holding her hand through each contraction. Unable to hear her own cries of pain, Bethany seemed almost detached from the process, focusing instead on Miles' face for reassurance. He remained steady, signing encouragement when possible, and simply maintaining eye contact when the pain became too intense for communication. After 12 hours of labor, as dawn broke over the mountains, their son was born a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. The midwife placed the crying infant on Bethany's chest, and though she couldn't hear his first cries, she felt the vibration of them against her skin. The look of wonder that transformed her face in that moment was something Miles knew he would remember until his dying day. They named him Samuel, after Bethany's grandfather. Miles signed the name letter by letter into his tiny palm, an introduction to the language that would bridge his world with his mother's. Though they wouldn't know for some time if Samuel's hearing was normal, they were prepared to love and guide him regardless. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. Samuel's hearing proved perfect, and by age 3, he was fluent in both spoken English and sign language, often serving as an interpreter between his mother and strangers. A daughter, Emma, joined the family 2 years after Samuel, equally blessed with healthy hearing and quick to learn signing. Miles expanded his blacksmith shop to include more elaborate metalwork, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for his craftsmanship. Bethany, meanwhile, took over more responsibilities at the apothecary as her father aged, eventually developing her own line of herbal remedies that were sought after by customers from as far away as Boise City. Their home remained a haven of understanding in a world that still sometimes struggled to accept Bethany's differences. Miles continued to innovate ways to make life easier for his wife, a system of mirrors positioned to show who was approaching the house from the road, floor lamps that flashed when someone knocked at the door, even a special clock that released a puff of scented oil at specific hours to help Bethany track time when she was working alone. The language of their hands evolved too, incorporating private signs and gestures that held meaning only for them, shorthand expressions of love, inside jokes, silent communications that could pass between them across a crowded room. Their children added to this family vocabulary, creating signs for favorite toys or secret messages between siblings. When Samuel turned 10, a traveling teacher from the East Coast's first school for the deaf stopped in Idaho City while documenting sign language variations across the country. He spent several days with the Landon family, marveling at the unique system they had developed. Before leaving, he asked permission to include some of their innovations in a book he was compiling, ensuring that the language Miles had once struggled to learn from a single thin volume would be preserved and expanded for future generations. "You've created something remarkable here," the teacher told Miles as they stood watching Bethany sign an elaborate story to a group of neighborhood children, deaf and hearing alike, gathered around her. Not just a family, but a bridge between worlds. Miles nodded, his chest tight with pride as he observed his wife's expressive hands painting pictures in the air. "She taught me that silence has its own kind of music," he replied. "You just need to learn how to hear it with your eyes." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Miles surprised Bethany with a journey to San Francisco, where a renowned school for the deaf had recently opened. They spent a month in the city, meeting other deaf adults, learning new signs and sharing their own experiences. For Bethany, who had never encountered another deaf person since losing her hearing, the experience was transformative. She returned to Idaho City with renewed purpose, starting a small class to teach sign language to anyone interested. The class began with just a handful of curious children and adults, but grew steadily over the years. By the time Bethany and Miles celebrated their 30th anniversary, nearly half the town could communicate at least basic signs. The apothecary shop, now run primarily by Samuel while his grandfather enjoyed retirement, became known as a place where deaf customers from surrounding areas could shop without facing the usual difficulties of communication. Emma, who had inherited her mother's gift for healing and her father's mechanical aptitude, went east to study medicine, one of the first women from Idaho Territory to do so. She returned as Dr. Emma Landon, establishing a practice that became known for accommodating patients with various disabilities. The modified stethoscope Miles had created decades earlier found a permanent place in her examination room. As Miles and Bethany entered their 60s, Idaho City had changed dramatically from the rough mining town of their youth. The railroad had arrived, bringing new residents and modern conveniences. Electric lights began replacing gas lamps in businesses along Main Street. Yet the little yellow house remained largely unchanged, a testament to the enduring love that had built it. On cool evenings, residents might still glimpse the aging couple sitting on their porch, hands moving in conversation as they had for nearly 4 decades. Younger generations, who had grown up seeing their silent dialogue, thought nothing unusual of it. To the children and grandchildren of Idaho City, the sight of an elderly blacksmith speaking with his hands to his deaf wife was simply part of the fabric of their community, a living reminder that love finds its own language. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted across their garden, Miles and Bethany sat together watching their 4 grandchildren play. Samuel's 2 boys were teaching Emma's daughters a game that involved both spoken words and signs, their small hands moving confidently through the air. "Did you ever imagine this?" Bethany signed to her husband, nodding toward the children. "When you first learned to spell hello to me," Miles smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. His hands, still strong but now gnarled with arthritis, moved more slowly than in his youth. "I imagined a conversation," he signed back, "but you gave me a lifetime of them." Bethany leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that had become as meaningful as any sign in their personal language. In the silence, they shared a silence that had never truly been silent at all, lay the story of a love that had defied expectations, bridged worlds, and ultimately transformed not just their lives but an entire community. As the afternoon sun warmed their faces, Miles took Bethany's hand and pressed it gently to his heart, just as he had during their first dance decades ago. The steady rhythm beneath her palm spoke volumes without a single word, or sign a testament to the truth they had discovered together in that apothecary shop so many years before. That sometimes the most profound communications require no sound at all.